So I wanted to kind of talk about what you've got going on in that article that you wrote on your newsletter there. I thought that
Yeah,
was pretty
yeah.
good.
That one, the COVID one.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
you're officially a COVID denier now, right?
No, no, I'm a COVID believer. I
Yeah.
believe in the I've always the first point at which I heard the lab leak theory was actually in early January 2020. And the way in which I heard it was that I heard from someone that Wendy Deng, who used to be married to Rupert Murdoch, was saying that it leaked from a lab. So, Wendy Deng, if you look at her history, she's quite a character, but she's certainly not unconnected. And so, in a way, the first way that I heard this was basically as an indirect rumor, coming from people who would be expected to know this. And then it's sort of obviously, it's just, there's sort of too much circumstantial evidence from a Bayesian perspective to really make it, even like it should be the null hypothesis, essentially.
Right. Well, it seems I've been kind of following the story for some time, consistently covering whatever I could find on it on the radio, and Steve Hilton did a good story investigating this way back on Fox News. And then you had, of course, the science writer Nicholas Wade did that good Substack piece that really laid it out pretty strongly, the circumstantial evidence
Yeah.
for the lab. But, now, of course, it's become mainstream. But the question is, how can people take anything that the social media sites and news media say seriously about almost anything
Well,
when they so deliberately, put their thumb on the scale of this being a considered option.
well, it's I mean, it's just an illustration of a sort of a broader phenomenon. It's a very visible illustration, and I think that a while ago on my blog, I was or newsletter or whatever we're calling them these days. I was saying, drawing the obvious comparison between COVID and Chernobyl. And what you saw when you looked at Chernobyl is that you're like, imagine you're a Soviet citizen and you're looking at Chernobyl, and how are you? I mean, this is the conventional wisdom. How are you supposed to think about it? Are you supposed to think that the director of the plant is responsible? Are you supposed to think that, the chief scientist of the plant is responsible? Are you supposed to think that the regional power administration is responsible? Are you supposed to, and that goes on, are you supposed to think that the general secretary is responsible? Are you supposed to think that the whole Soviet system is, in a sense, responsible? Can I sort of trace a line between this unbelievable comedy of, like, disaster, and the way things actually work in our country? And, and sort of show that in a way this is not an exception, this is really a generalized problem. And so, the question that you're asking is there any authority that's out there that's worth trusting? And the problem really is that, of course, there isn't, and there hasn't been for quite some time. And what's more interesting, that's sort of not so unusual in a way. What is a more interesting question is why that niche is not properly filled. And so when you look at these authorities, that are sort of have this prestige of purveying truth that we now, through this very, very, visible example, which will become only more visible as it kind of cements and becomes what everyone believes, which I hope will happen in some way. By this very visible example, you see that, as I phrased it in that post, maybe putting virologists in charge of virology was not such a good idea.
Mm-hmm.
And our the whole way in which our system of governance works, even down to such a thing as virology, and clearly virology is relevant to governments. But even down to such a thing as virology, you have a whole system of government that sort of reinforces expertise with power. that says, let's put the virologists in charge of virology. And it so happens that when you put the virologists in charge of virology, they actually have a number of conflicts of interest. And those conflicts of interest, sort of cause them institutionally to have strange incentives that, even if they were just like thought viruses were totally cool or like really cared about protecting humanity against viruses and had like big private fortunes and just could do whatever they want. Would they be doing some of this shit? No, I don't think they would. I think that a lot of these experiments were driven by the bureaucratic incentives that virologists have when you put them in charge of virology. So, for example, when you look at these Chinese, all of these gain-of-function experiments, there's a Twitter thread by the notorious Dr. Peter Daszak where he's like, which he's left up, where he's like just so excited that he's found he and his collaborators in Wuhan have found bat coronaviruses that could infect human cells. And the reason he's excited about this is basically, why is this research being done? This research is being done for the same, direct concrete motives that all researchers have, which is you want more high impact publications. So you have essentially this thing that's sort of partly the pursuit of nature that has this justification that's total baloney, that like basically like going out and playing with fire will help us like protect the house against fire or something, like and like there's no one can articulate at all a benefit of this research. Like it's really speculative and hand wavy if there is anything at all. So why are they doing it? They're doing it to get high impact papers. And the thing is, that's a disease that has affected American science considerably. That disease is much more rampant in Chinese science, which publishes, obviously there's no like special Chinese science that publishes in the same journals that we do. And in China, to advance in your career, you have very basic metric based, like really stuff that in the U.S. would strike us as crass. You want to be the head of a major university hospital surgery department, you need 4 high impact publications or something like that. It's like the straight up quota system. And so, what they've basically developed in Wuhan was like, here is a series of papers that we can write about things that seem important. Why do they seem important? They seem important because they're scary and dangerous to the whole human race. Therefore, the human race should protect itself from these threats, which we've gone out and painstakingly found and cultivated by funding us more. And therefore, our work is important and justifies these high-impact publications. So you have this whole system that is being directed. It's not being directed for like the prestige of the Soviet Union or something. It's being directed in this whole other way, which is completely irrational when looked at, as a whole from a top-down sense. But basically, moves everyone's perception within virology of, oh, this is how I and my peers get funded. Because within virology, of course, if you're a virologist and you're calling for a shutdown of gain-of-function research, which, a number of virologists, real Harvard PhD virologists, genuine experts, were brave enough to do, which shows you, that this field still works to a considerable extent. But it's also, they couldn't actually do it. And what actually happened is, specifically with this research, I'm a little fuzzy on the details, but what seems to have actually happened is that they basically, this effort got like some like board that had to approve gain-of-function research. And then it was just a simple matter to say, well, this is not a gain-of-function research thing, so it doesn't have to go before the board, or the board can be stacked with the right kind of people, it's just child's play to get past these pieces of paper, right? And so, the thing is, if you're a virologist and you're like, this kind of research should be shut down, you're an asshole. Because basically, all your friends, this is what everyone is doing. There's a global consensus that it matters. Everyone's like, well, to protect ourselves against the threat of these emerging viruses, we must study them and play with them and put them up our noses. And it's ludicrous, but it's a sort of shared reality distortion field, of this entire field of human inquiry. So, and there's just absolutely no one who can say, wait a minute, this is fucked. And actually, we're going to, no one within, even within the deep state, even within the civil service, like no one, okay, could Dr. Fauci have done it? Probably he could have done it. But if he was the guy to do it, he wouldn't be where he was. So you have these little imperial bureaucrats, but these imperial bureaucrats who are, in some cases have a kind of monarchical authority, but these imperial bureaucrats are kind of like Putin. They're sort of tied to this like web of mafia, and all of their power comes from these sort of mysterious cliques that they're tied into. And so, they can't basically tell their friends to go fuck themselves because their friends are where their power comes from, even if they could get away with it, but they'd probably be like burning their whole career or something. So, you have, this is the mind, this is the sort of the brain that drove this research. And then I think most Americans would just be like, why is the US funding a lab in China? And they would have no idea that that's a perfectly normal, regular thing to do. Right. And so you have this whole sort of strange system that nobody designed, that sort of doesn't seem to be working for any rational purpose, that if you dig into it with like an ounce of common sense, you're like, well, even if it was, a bat bit a donkey which bit a goose, this easily could have caused this problem. And so, like, you certainly are well beyond denying the plausibility of a lab leak at this point, which means that this is a threat that was being completely ignored, whether or not, the bat bit the donkey bit the goose, right? So you have this situation where you have this machine which seems to be on autopilot, which is clearly, can survive this sort of brutal physical assault of Trump just completely unscathed, with its operations just somewhat disrupted. And by the way, it was some the Trump administration actually sided with the gain of function people in some obscure bureaucratic spat. So it certainly helps to have the political side of the administration on your side, but, the CDC is untouchable. It's like a rock in a storm. And so you see that, this whole system, virology, is completely unaccountable except to the virologists. And you essentially can't imagine a sort of an organized way of holding it accountable. In fact, one of the best things that's come out of this is that you've seen, basically you have seen the creation of like sort of quality, not even necessarily decentralized, because any center of thinking is a center, but you've seen basically, a certain level of quality non-mainstream scholarship emerge just in the effort to sort of bring this down. The problem is that the institutional strength of this, sort of ad hoc machine for holding one tiny element of virology accountable sort of doesn't conceive itself as becoming an institution that would hold all of science accountable, and we can't even imagine what that institution would be shaped like. Right. So, you have this basically this very deep problem here. And, if I can, pick on many of the people that might be listening here, what instead, sort of conservative media has chosen to do is to focus on breadth rather than depth. And so, there's a lot of owning the libs. There's a lot of like, we've proved them wrong, so that means we're going to win. Well, yes, assuming that there is a, beneficent and active God out there who basically will solve all your problems for you, you've proved them wrong, and so you're definitely going to win. And other than that, you've proved them wrong, and you think you're the first, and it's like that great still from the Coen Brothers movie, First Time, and so really the question of what would it mean to have an authority, both in the sense of a formal power and in the sense of actually an institution capable of doing the job, that could basically think about this and be like, no, actually virologists, like, you should be studying this and not that, because this is basically, the flaming self-licking ice cream cone, and that is something that is actually super relevant and important, right? And so, I mean, there was certainly plenty in retrospect. If you'd looked at this pandemic and you'd said, okay, I have a time machine. I'm going to go back 10 years and tell virologists to prepare for this effectively. Some of the work that was done, sort of post SARS, that actually really did help with SARS too. Like the stabilized spike protein thing is really a thing, right? So, but then there was all this stuff that was motivated by this kind of close call pandemic of SARS, which of course was like 10 to 20 times more deadly at least than COVID. That just turned into what actually created COVID, as far as I think the null hypothesis should be at this point. And so to have that level of sort of direction over science is something where, first of all, who would be doing that thinking? Who actually has the credibility to think in that way? And then how would you combine that with the authority to effectively think in that way? That's the systemic problem that this event raises for people. And I don't see people, sort of even, they're like, well, maybe people should wear, 3 more masks when they're working with, Chinese lab cultures involving live bats.
Apparently the level of security that the Wuhan Institute of Virology was using to do this type of research was on the level of a dentist office.
That's right. BSL 2. I think that's an accurate characterization. And I'm going to butcher the Chinese here, but the fact is that there's a well-known phenomenon in China. Is not Japan. It's not even Korea. There's a well-known phenomenon in China, and I'm going to butcher the Chinese here, xiaobuduo, which means basically good enough, close enough for government work, is like a real thing in like a lot of Chinese enterprise, right? And if you're a major Western firm working with that, you just have to make it very, very clear what good enough is. But in this case, basically good enough was wearing gloves in the lab. And not mouth pipetting, bat spit, but yeah, I mean, this is what this, like Chernobyl, in which they're like, oh, we're going to test the emergency systems by causing a reactor accident and turning all the emergency systems off. This was a very predictable disaster in many ways. And yet, the chance that it would have been predicted or headed off was, I think, very low in retrospect.
Isn't the only one of the few mechanisms one could imagine to rein in this kind of field that, like you're talking about, would be skin in the game, that there should be repercussions if it can be, demonstrated with a more credible evidence that folks like, Dr. Fauci continued to fund this type of lab with dentist-level security standards, even after State Department cables were indicating, hey, this is not quality, this is not a safe enough lab to do this stuff?
I think that's like punishing the, the regional nuclear facility administrator or the regional head of electricity for Chernobyl. I think that, sure, the problem with basically governance through sort of random punishment like this is it's like saying, well, should Alger Hiss have been punished? Well, he should have been punished, and of course he was punished. Did that have anything to do really with the, sort of computing an accurate historical reckoning and unraveling the legacy of the U.S.-USSR relationship between 1933 and 1945? No, it did not. Right. Or 1923 and 1945. I mean, and so, can you say, of course, in this populist sense that, this should, Dr. Fauci's career should suffer for this? Maybe you can. I don't think it really gains anything in particular. People are thrown under the bus in the system all the time. And, what I think conservatives often miss is they get someone thrown under the bus, and they're like, well, this will send them a message. And, the message that it sends is that, the pole of success is greasy and people will always fall off for random reasons. And anybody will be thrown under the bus if he's basically less, more useful to the party under the bus, right? And, there are always plenty of people to replace these people. And so you're not like, if you're up against, an oligarchy, a strategy of attrition is really not your best move. And so, yeah, you could, I mean, it's,
well, yeah, I wasn't suggesting just Dr. Fauci. I'm saying I'm looking at it more of the critique of what happens when government has these monopoly funding mechanisms that dominate an entire field of knowledge, like what you're saying, not virology, where there's no feedback mechanism, there's no brakes for what they can do, because the entire faceless bureaucracy can make a mistake and kill 3 million plus people, and they get more funding and they just keep going. And it's like, how in the hell is that sustainable?
There's no, if you look at the structure of, sort of funding and power kind of follow each other. And as not only is virology funded by these, the government, what's more important is that it's trusted by the government. And so essentially you have, if you imagine a weird world in which virology was not trusted by the government. And so you had basically a totally separate, let's say that, we're like, okay, oversight over virology is going to go to the Catholic Church, right? So this is a completely different set of people than the scientists. And the scientists will be like, oh yeah, we want to put this thing in mutant rats with human lungs to see if it kills the rats. And the bishops would be like, what? And in this case, it's not too difficult to predict the bishop's response. And in this case, I think the bishops would have been right. In other cases, they might be wrong. But the point is that there you have a separate authority. And one thing, if we want to get all American today, one thing that you'll note that was a very strong belief of the founders and very true is that only power can be set against power, right? And so your problem is that you have, the incentives acting on this field have essentially kind of turned them into mad scientists, and they have an incentive to basically, play mad scientist. And you have all these kind of, the best virologists in the world are kind of all sort of turning into young Frankenstein, and just because they have a bureaucratic incentive to do so. And that bureaucratic incentive is felt especially keenly in China, which happens to be a very bureaucratic place in certain strange ways. And there's no power that can be set against them. Sure, you can say, oh, let's let's prosecute someone for this, let's scapegoat, someone for that. That's, from the perspective of power, that's just taken as kind of an occupational natural hazard, like crashing your car in Formula One. You're not really having an effect on the system. You're not really teaching people a lesson when you basically scapegoat them like this. You're teaching them to be more risk averse. They are already extremely risk averse. And you're sort of setting up this new category of risks, which is not going to cover the next thing they fuck up like this.
What about cutting funding? You don't think that's effective either? Or
well,
dramatically?
I mean, yeah, I mean, this sort of gets into the question of, what I do with all these people. If I was in charge, I would actually, God forbid, obviously I'm a philosopher, not a Caesar, but I do feel that we could maybe just possibly use a Caesar. And so, the question of what would Caesar do with these people is, I think, quite relevant. And, one of the things that is notable about Caesar in specific is that, despite his treatment of the Gauls, when it came to Romans, he was an extremely merciful man. He was, if anything, largely too merciful. And there's nothing he liked more than to basically take the personnel of the enemy and, having totally institutionally dissolved and destroyed that enemy, regard those personnel as his own. And so this was a very, very sharp contrast from the general Roman pattern of these kinds of events, with these sort of failed, Caesars like Marius and Sylla, where they'd basically just kill all the people, who were big shots in the old regime and take their stuff. And which seemed very logical. And Caesar was like, no, actually, we won, so there are people. So if you think about basically all of these virologists, first of all, you have to look at the field and make a determination. Is this still a real field of science? Are these people doing science? Are they actually in touch with the physical structure of reality? In this case, I think they are. So that's a lesser level of corruption than you'll find in other fields.
Like
right?
some
In other
parts
fields,
of physics and stuff, yeah.
Yeah, or even I mean, there's a whole ladder that descends downward from STEM, right? And clearly at a certain level, you're just looking at the equivalent of Marx-Lenin studies, kind of post 1989. There's no reason why Marx-Lenin studies should be taught in German universities in 1990, right? But is there a reason why virology should be taught in American universities, supposing that there is such a thing? Yes, definitely. So, these people are in general valuable researchers, right? And the thing is that their incentives have directed them into this extremely toxic and dangerous, game of stamp collecting. And the first thing that needs to be done is basically to stop that game. So what I would actually do with all of these scientists is I would actually reward them. What I would do is I would say, okay, your research is motivated by accountability. It's actually motivated by saying you as a scientist are going to pursue this thing that is useful to the public. You're not going to just go and follow your whims like some 19th century naturalist. The public needs to be defended against the threat of bat coronaviruses, and you must pursue this threat. That's what they said to you. That's what Power said to you. And you said to Power, yes, I will go out and find the bat coronaviruses and evolve them to infect humans and tinker with their DNA and write more papers. You were asked to do that, and you did it. So in a sense, the doing of this thing is not, you're like someone who was asked to commit a war crime and did it. The doctrine that this sort of does it make you culpable in a sense? I think it makes you not a saint. I think that definitely makes you like the people who actually were like, no, I'm going to risk my career and speak out about against this, are definitely better than you. Okay, but that's not to say that you were a bad person. You were just actually a normal person. You're doing normal science. And so what we're going to do is we're going to say, fine, this accountability thing hasn't worked out. Here's what we're going to do instead of accountability. We're going to take your whole grant stream. We're never going to ask you to write another goddamn grant again. We're going to take your whole grant stream. We're going to extend that out indefinitely as basically a perpetual, disbursement. We're going to securitize that into a bond that issues that revenue stream. We're going to give you that bond personally. So actually what we're going to do is we're going to sever all of your ties to and that includes overhead. That includes overhead. Scientists, if you're out there, you know what I mean. So that adds like 60%, right? So all of this revenue stream that's out there that has been flowing through the universities and through these systems now flows directly to the scientist and is in fact entirely in the scientist's personal possession. So, picture yourself, you're a professor of like stamp collecting bullshit. And you could have one of two attitudes about this. You could be like, well, I got a family. I grill on the weekends. This is a good gig. Am I passionate about what I do? Not really. I haven't really felt that way since I was about 23, but it's a thing. Suddenly you have this system. It presents you with this bond. What do? You sell it. You're like, okay, I got to diversify my portfolio. This is my money. I'm keeping it. I don't really care. I'm not going to pretend to care. Or you basically say, and in that case, science is well rid of you, and you should not be out there collecting flaming stamps. You should be basically out there feeling lucky for having won the lottery. And you basically got bought out of your power. And so once you basically buy all of these all this deadwood out in a very spectacular way that rewards them considerably for being in the right place at the right time, perhaps their eligibility is diminished unless they write a full and frank confession. But this is very straightforward kind of Machiavellian politics. You want to basically actually own these people, and you certainly don't want them to be hostile to you. And so you're basically saying, if you are a real virologist, here's what you get to do. You get to study anything about virology that you want. You get to basically be the sort of guardian of this little endowed institution that's basically been created from your grant structure as a principal investigator, and basically shepherd it forward into the future. You get to train, your successor. You get to found your own school of virology. You can basically think whatever the fuck you want about virology and write whatever the fuck you want about virology indefinitely. You can basically be like a Victorian gentleman scientist with a big endowment and a restless curiosity, right? And so, if you're actually studying virology under those terms, the chance that you're going to go like full like mad scientist on us and be like, no, we must find all the bad viruses and study them, but first we must put on gloves, right? Is not what's going to happen here, right? And so,
but what if you gave them that and then they still didn't wash their hands when they ate their ham sandwich and they unleashed?
I think at that point you're dealing with the kind of people that would do that would just take the money. And so, what you're doing is you're basically saying, if I look at the professionals in this field, they're all still very talented. They actually know something about viruses. This is very good and very important. Their conscientiousness is all over the map. And because their conscientiousness is all over the map because it's had a conflict of interest with their professional standards. And this is actually what drove me to basically drop out of computer science, is that I could feel these tensions going in two different directions. And when your conscientiousness and your professional standards, and your sort of professional advancement are pulling in different directions, your conscientiousness is going to suffer. So, broadly speaking, what we observe in virology is that, and in much of science, is that it really needs to have more than anything, what needs to be restored is the independence and the conscientiousness of the scientists themselves. There was recently an exposure of a big collusion ring in computer science conference papers, where basically people steered articles to favorable reviewers and so forth, sort of precisely for this paper gaming reason, because the paper count is just so important, and it's all important, right? And there was an interesting post about this that got some popularity, and the post was like, please everyone cheat more openly. And it was like, it's good that this like just blatant crap has been exposed, because the low-key, subtle, cool, can always get away with it version is everywhere. And it's everything. And, and this is just like all the institutions of science. Science is sort of such a perfect example of the regime change we need in some ways, because the people in it are generally great. They're generally fine, but all of the institutions just need to just be utterly blown up into dust, and that dust needs to be like taped off and sealed away and like dumped deep in the ocean. And I think that I think there are very few scientists who would tell you that the institutions of science in general are working well. And so, in over all of these fields, and of course it's not just a problem in science, but in all of these fields, what we're seeing is that you have this sort of enormous kind of corruption of, corruption is not too strong a word. It's not really quite monetary corruption per se, but corruption is essentially the manifestation of a conflict of interest. Mm-hmm. And when you have this situation where, the science is in charge of the science, it basically falls into these kind of attractor structures that are just pure conflict of interest. And once you have essentially bad science drives out good science, because once you have, bad science that sort of feels a little stinky in any way, whether it's, unoriginal, whether it's, once it starts to not smell so fresh, it has to defend itself. And because it has to defend itself, it has to kind of form these oligarchical structures of defense. And that's where we get this incredible, Dr. Daszak, who, as of all people, Nathan Robinson, the ultra lib notes in his ultra lib magazine Current Affairs, is basically like, the prime suspect in the murder getting himself appointed as the chief detective, right? I mean, it's just like it literally, he's the person who like organized this research and managed this research, and then he organizes the response to say that he's not guilty, and then he organizes the investigation in China, right? And people find this credible, all because it has this sort of strange 1930s alphabet soup branding of the World Health Organization. Who created this organization? God only knows. Who is it made of? God only knows. How does it work? God only knows. But it has those 3 letters, and it's more than just prestigious. It's legitimate in some abstract sense, right? And it has this legitimacy. And where does this legitimacy come from? Were they elected? Were they like? It has this, legitimacy, which seems to sort of flow out of, pure air, and in fact flows basically out of the Roosevelt administration, and is like, totally, conscious, if conscientiousness among scientists is weak, conscientiousness among science bureaucrats, science journalists, and people like that is an order of magnitude weaker. And especially when you get into the world of the international Swiss third world bureaucracy, which is just rife with all kinds of nepotism and corruption. And I mean, like literally Ghebreyesus, if I'm pronouncing his name correctly, before he became director general of the WHO, he's from obviously Ethiopia, which has been a public health power for quite some time, and his previous claim to fame was literally that he helped cover up a cholera epidemic, and so or was credibly accused of helping to cover up a cholera epidemic. Apparently, it was just some diarrhea, and nothing to worry about, citizens, and so you have this thing that is operating in these procedures that are completely irrational, that no one has any rational reason to trust, that no one even understands, that is basically taken seriously on the basis of nothing. And I think where I differ from most commentators on this is that I think most commentators, look at this and they're like, we must call attention to this. Okay, great. You've called attention to it. What is to be done? Well, it must be fixed. How is it to be fixed? Hand waving. This thing is wrong. That thing is wrong. And I'm just, I look at this thing and I'm like, no, it obviously needs to be replaced. And no one is particularly working on replacing it in a way that I would consider really adequate. Let's take just, for example, okay, you have this sort of ad hoc effort to, this drastic team, as it's called, a bunch of, scientists, mostly pseudonymous, who basically have kind of worked together to really pound this hypothesis over the last year. Okay, that's one thing. That's a group of people. That's better than individual people. How do you make that into an institution? How do you replicate that? How do you basically go around and say, okay, first and foremost, let's create something that is capable of taking these bureaucratic public science conclusions and really revisiting them in the spirit of, Victorian science. In which is basically a no holds barred spirit. Scientists still know how to do this. They just won't do it in public. You go to any journal club or anything, and you'll see people tear papers to shreds. But doing it in public is this act of aggression, and so and it really is an act of aggression, and you just can't do that. You can't make enemies in science. Nobody has room for that, and so you have this whole system that's become kind of dysfunctional because of its lack of competitive discourse. You need some way of resuscitating that in a way that's not just like Alex Jones fans arguing at each other in a subreddit. You need basically high quality adversarial discourse, which is kind of the original foundation of science. You need that to happen in a structured and an effective way that can sort of be broadened. And instead you just have people complaining, basically.
And that's the big story of this last year and this year is, And ongoing is the fact that if you want to talk about science, you have to go through this big other called the science, right? And this the science versus science is the big story that we're all dealing with.
Right, and the problem is there's only the science, there's no science, right? And so the thing is, when people think about, and partly this is due to an excess of sort of libertarian and even democratic ideology, is people think that the alternative to the science is basically, whatever you heard on Joe Rogan last week or something. And no, actually, if you want there to be science as opposed to the science, that doesn't just happen, right? That's not just a thing of like, oh yeah, I really have this like expert with this cool website I like, and I buy supplements, and they totally, make my dick hard, like, I mean, and that's sort of the quality of what's really sad here is that you're putting, essentially, you have this situation which is very common in conflicts where to a certain extent, each side is right about the other. And so, you have this situation where you look at, basically what, the professors and the big shots at Harvard have managed to come up with, and you're just like, wow, you guys really just screwed the fucking pooch. And they did. And yet you have nothing really worthy of mention to set against that. You have only random individuals who may randomly occasionally be right, but you don't have any power that you're creating to set against it. And so, that lack of understanding that essentially only institutions and organizations can have power, that there's no like, oh, we're going to give science back to the people, and, is there's no such thing as populist science. It's ridiculous. It's a contradiction in terms. And so when you basically, this is a symptom of the larger problem that when you essentially when you say to, Aristotle, identified three basically systems of government: monarchy, rule of the one; oligarchy, rule of the few; democracy, rule of the many. When we translate those into modern political English, instead of monarchy, oligarchy, democracy, we say dictatorship, democracy, populism. Right? So essentially, when your only opponent for oligarchy, or as we call it, democracy, is democracy, or as we call it, populism, you're essentially saying, okay, here I have this other way of governing which is better than your way of governing. And, if that's not true, you're really kind of shooting yourself in the foot, because you're essentially saying the alternative to oligarchy, the alternative to the rule of these experts who happen to have become really just literally fatally corrupted by the structure of their own oligarchy and the perverse incentives that it creates. The alternative to this is populism, and the alternative to this is basically, whatever gets the most shares on Facebook is going to prevail. Okay, that's populism. You want real populism? Hold a Facebook election, right? And Facebook I think Facebook at this point is probably better at identifying unique individuals than the state of Georgia. And I don't know about Florida, but if I were trying to trust who can identify the bots better, I might go with Facebook, right? But in any case, if you're only if your only replacement for Dr. Fauci and Peter Daszak and Shing Li and Batwoman, and if your only replacement for this system is let's have a Facebook election to see if vaccines will make our noses fall off, you're really you're batting zero. You're going to continue to bat zero. You basically, you're only pretending to have a solution. And in fact, what you're doing is you're essentially reinforcing the propaganda that says, wow, the rule of these experts is sort of the only way. So when you basically take those two approaches, one is let's fix this system in some way or another, and the other is let's replace it with, I really can't imagine a society much less suited to democracy than the one we live in. That is much less suited to populism. Populism is most effective when you have a homogenous population, when you have a virtuous population, when you have a well-educated population, when you have finally an aggressive population, a population that's basically not, whatever a passionate population, whatever the opposite of apathetic is. And if you look at all those bars, we're sitting down there, near zero next to like the Romans of like 300 AD, right? And so if populism in the leadership of the many over the few and the one is really going to be your thing, you're basically taking something that doesn't work and you're saying, well, the only, which is, the rule of Fauci, Daszak, and Batwoman, and you're saying, well, my only alternative to this thing is something that seems much more improbable, that has basically never historically worked, that, even the founders were, extremely suspicious of. And so you're essentially leading your fellow prisoners back into the trap because you're leading them down what seems to be an escape route, but is in fact a box canyon. And, that's why I'm a monarchist, essentially. And so what this event does is it says, okay, you really need to think clearly about what it would take to turn virology back from a liability to the human race to an asset, because right now its balance sheet is pretty red. And until you can think sort of clearly about that and clearly about how should this have been done and under what kind of system, what sort of power would it take? And, this is a completely open-ended question. It doesn't have to be a monarchy of any kind. You can, in theory, I suppose, I've never heard of it, replace an oligarchy with another oligarchy. And so you're like, okay, how do I build... And, of course, even in a monarchy, no one's a government of one, right? So how do I build an institution that would have the credibility to basically stand up here, irrespective of the authority, which might have to be gotten by other means? But you don't have to. You might not even need the authority to just build the credibility. But essentially, what I see is that I see a lot of people talking about this stuff, and I see no one talking about how do you build the alternative credibility that's something that can say, no, this is not right.
Well, I want to throw out another factor here and get your take on it too, which is I was just listening to or watching a podcast with Brett Weinstein and the doctor Pierre Corey. You know this name, Pierre Corey?
I don't know Pierre Corey so well, but I know of Brett Weinstein.
So they were talking about this story that Dr. Corey has been a front person for around the world about the benefits people are having with using ivermectin as a prophylactic or even early treatment that's having significant effect apparently, and has had some trials, some good data. We've had the Mexico City as a policy started introducing it and really clamped down on COVID when they introduced it. You had the Ministry of Brazil indicating people should go check out ivermectin, and then they had the Twitter page, shut down by Twitter because it was considered to be, misinformation.
Yeah. I'll interrupt you. I'll interrupt you right here with my perspective on ivermectin, which is that I actually live in horse country out here, so there's a lot of feed stores and so forth. And I guess it was around February, I went to a conference in Vegas, which was full of COVID deniers. I was really the only one wearing a mask. So here I am in COVID world in Vegas. And in fact, at one point in COVID world, in this COVID fest, I found I was talking to one-on-one to someone who, is arguably one of the world's leading COVID deniers, a smart fellow, and more than that, he appeared to have a cold. So in any case, that's my COVID attitude. So I was like, what I did was before I went down to the feed store and I got myself one of these little tubes of, I forget the brand name. It's horse paste, but it's horse paste with ivermectin. And I ate a little, half spoonful of ivermectin every day, and I didn't get COVID. So that's your sample size of one. The thing is when I look and I'll tell you my thinking behind that, which was just a very simple rationalist type thinking. I was like, well, the risks of ivermectin are very well known, and they're very well known to be very low, and so my ability to either evaluate this research by myself, or B, delegate my trust to another party or institution which I feel is worthy of being trusted to validate this pile of evidence, is basically zero. So I don't have an institute, could I listen to some podcast and someone sound perfectly convincing? I'm sure I could. But I would be like someone sitting in a courtroom, basically listening only to the prosecution's case and being like, wow, this fucker's got to hang. But if only all I heard was the defense case, I was like, wow, this guy has serious, charges for a claim against the government. People are... One of the elements of populism is basically people think that they can do this job universally by themselves, which is just, unless you're Johnny von Neumann, is just ridiculous. And so you essentially have to have, and maybe you have that kind of trust in Brett Weinstein. I don't know. I haven't listened to a lot of Brett Weinstein. You can imagine sort of building, that trust in a way, but, you have to, you're still... Even when you think about, here's this podcaster I really trust him, Brett would never let me down, he would never tell me something, blah, blah, blah. The level of trust that you're building there is like, 1,000 times smaller and less imposing than the institutions that it's coming up against. It's like saying, I don't trust my bank, so I'm going to give my money to Johnny down the street. Right, Johnny's going to put it under his mattress, and it was Johnny's mattress. Well, Johnny's he's got 2 deadbolts on his door. He's strapped and he's got a big pit bull, right? And that's basically the sort of banking equivalent of trusting, Brett Weinstein. Yeah, is anybody going to fuck with Johnny down the street? No, probably not. Is he going to give you back your money? Yeah, he probably is. But is this like a bank with marble pillars and an FDIC charter and fuck no, right? And is it a blockchain? Fuck no. And so you're essentially doing you're playing, when you play with these stakes, you're playing against, this is the most this principle of trusting the experts is the most fundamental principle of how our regime works. And it worked very, very well at first, because at first it relied on experts from a different era when they were not trusted, and those experts had no conflicts of interest. And those conflicts of interest basically poison sort of all the, fields that tell the government what to do. And they're those institutions are fucked. They're done. You can't recover from that poisoning. And yet you need something that is the equivalent of the bank with marble pillars and not Johnny down the street.
Well, my point in what I was introducing, it's not just, I've been, looking at this. I'm not an advocate of ivermectin. I'm just pointing out that it's a generic drug. And that's the elephant in the room for me, is that the reason why the argument is stacked against it in such a way that it looks like a, pillar marble bank compared to Johnny down the street is because Johnny down the street is suggesting a solution that's not patented, that has no intellectual property protection. That's the issue for me. You see what I mean?
That's a slightly different issue. I think that I wouldn't say that there's no truth to that necessarily, because the connections between certainly the sort of the financial structures that connect drug companies to academics and drug reviewers are certainly a thing and kind of cryptic. I don't know. I would say that what is at least as important in this is the same thing with the lab leak theory, in that you're witnessing just simple ideological polarization. I think that if you had And one thing you see with these polarizations is like the switch over in masks in February 2020. What you see is that basically as soon as the right really stakes out a position, the left will stake out the opposite position. They have a very strong incentive to anti-conform. So essentially, once you have something like ivermectin that it sort of spreads among these very diffuse and still relatively ineffective kind of counter networks, or hydroxychloroquine, for which I think that maybe the ivermectin evidence is slightly better. But I also took a bunch of chloroquine I had lying around, just because I thought it's a harmless drug, and the in the doses and whatever that I took. But the so I'm very sort of agnostic on these specific points. Could we easily have imagined, mainstream science driving, an ivermectin? Possibly. The fact that basically the real, in a sense, the corruption that they would express here is they would be like, you can't actually do trials on this because no one will fund the trials.
That's what I'm trying to get at. Is that
but the thing is that when you think about it the way you're thinking about it, you sort of think about it as a kind of you're thinking about it in this kind of progressive era sort of muckraking thing of this kind of this is being suppressed because it makes these people money. It's actually more that they just look at this and they know that it actually can't happen, and so their bias is for things that can happen that can actually save people's lives.
But that's what I'm getting at, is that in order to get these products approved with our processes that we have, you have to come up with something new that can be patented, not use a generic drug to afford the process. That's what I'm saying.
And so the result of that is that it's just like many of the people who work on drug repurposing, who are the people that came up with the idea of ivermectin, are doing the same thing. They're thinking around the regs. They're thinking around, they're basically like, because they live in this practical world that has been regulated in this way. Basically, they're like, okay, what is the most practical thing that we can do to fight this disease? So they're actually on the right side. They're just sort of being more kind of pragmatic in a sense than maybe they're being pragmatic in a small rather than large sense. And that's their habit and their reflex. And so basically when they see something that, basically cannot be harnessed in this way, because it can't be, it can't be studied in this way, they're basically naturally going to be like, well, this is something that we shouldn't waste effort on, because even if medically it works, bureaucratically it can't work. So it can't
that's
work.
What I'm trying to get at, is that the elephant in the room that I see. You were talking about what's fundamentally going wrong with the science here, and I'm saying I think a big elephant in the room is the mutations and incentives that happen when we have IP dominating the field of what's considered medical science. Because when you have something that, in order for you to afford to go through the bureaucratic loops to get this to the market, you have to have a product that can end in a patent, that you can reap the profits to afford the process to get approved in the first place. So it is automatically... It automatically skews. That's not a scientific basis to start. You see what I mean? I just want to get this point. When you are automatically excluding generic or natural things that can't be patented anymore, because they simply you can't afford to run those through to the finish line, then you have not started with a scientific foundation at the beginning. You know what I mean?
Well, yeah, sure. I mean, since you're interested in this point, one thing that most people don't know is that one of the restrictions on patenting, I'm a huge opponent of patents, in most cases and in most situations, or the way they're used now. Of course, software patents have been a disaster that many others have spoken about. One thing that most people don't know is that in a closely related area of medicine, which is not pharmaceuticals but surgery, patents for surgical procedures are specifically disallowed, and there's also no approval path for surgical procedures. It's essentially as if this whole apparatus was never created, as long as you're basically doing dangerous things to a human body with a knife instead of with molecules. Which to me is 6 of one, half a dozen of the other, but it provides this vision, which is, there's still, of course, many impediments to surgical research, but they're relatively small. They're like your hospital's review board or something. But if you use a 50-cent piece of plastic, suddenly that's 10 years and $10 billion, right? And so is that a flaw in the system? I would say certainly that's an example of the flaw in which that's an example of one of the many flaws with which the American medical industry is regulated. The way I would think about that, and you'll forgive me for basically whenever I see these specific things, I always want to tie them back to the most general problem that I can find. Because what happens in practice is that when you want to fix these problems, the more energy you focus on fixing a problem that is, either a symptom of a larger problem or even just a small problem of its own, and I would characterize this problem with medical patenting as a small problem of its own compared to the larger problems of the system as a whole. And so the more you basically take these small problems and you say, well, this is a special case of a much more general problem, you're taking the attention of all the people that are focused on the smaller problems and focused on different spots, and focusing all of that energy on the one spot of, wow, this is really a completely systemic problem. If you look, for example, at the response to Chernobyl, it wasn't like, wow, people in Ukraine are like, wow, the Ukraine power administration is corrupt from top to bottom, right? We must change the Ukraine power administration. Or we've become ferocious anti-graphite nuclear reactor advocates. We're going to stand up and wave our banners, and get arrested by the KGB, by proposing safe heavy water reactors, right? And the thing is, the more specific your complaint is, especially in a society where the apathy is rampant and there's a very, very low amount of civic energy, it really behooves you to concentrate that energy as much as possible. And so when you see a symptom, you sort of want to jump kind of directly to the general case, because the general case is the only way that symptom is likely to get solved, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and my suggestion is just that there is the fundamental problem I see, even with the gain of function research being done in the way it was done, is that the intention, of course, was to, hey, let's see what happens so that we can develop a vaccine in the case that this thing comes in the real world. So the incentive, the IP is already pushing reckless forms of scientific research.
I don't think it's the IP. Researchers in China don't get any IP, right? Like this is more, that specific justification is much more, it's the kind of boilerplate you read at the start of, you might see it in like a computer science paper where they're like, if we can solve, Montague's 4-vertex problem, we can cure cancer. And then you go on and you present your solution to Montague's 4-vertex problem. And if your solution is wrong, you'll be like mercilessly destroyed. But everyone is like, oh yeah, everybody knows Montague's vertex problem is deeply connected to cancer, right? And so when you're basically saying, what's happening here with that excuse, which should not be taken at face value, is it's like finding your 4-year-old playing, with matches, right, in the living room. And he's like, well, I'm trying to investigate what would happen if, suppose these curtains caught fire. Right. How would we get out of the house? So you're saying I'm giving
them too much credit for their...
Could we save the dog? And so you're basically giving, this kind of cock and bull story about the more, bat viruses we collect, the more effectively we can protect ourselves against, the kid is like, well, we're going to get practice in fire safety. Mm-hmm. Our evacuations are going to get quicker. The dog will smell the smoke, and it's just like, it's completely... It's the sort of assertion that because it is not a scientific assertion, even though it is an assertion, you're saying something that you purportedly believe, it can't be tested, it can't be weighed, it can't be judged. And so it's just basically this like line of bullshit that they toss off. And of course, they're not, like, yeah, sure, could you, like, no one, who the fuck could ever license a pan-coronavirus corona vaccine? You could never, license a multi-virus vaccine for viruses that don't. How would you test that, right? It's completely impossible, and it's much more impossible than testing ivermectin, or than improving ivermectin, and so you're in this, and they even have like fucked up pathways for repatenting old drugs. You basically file, like, thalidomide is sold for huge amounts of money as like a multiple myeloma, chemotherapy or something. They just give it a different name and say, well, our patent is on thalidomide for multiple myeloma or whatever it's good for. And so you're looking at this justification that actually has nothing to do with the reality of these people's careers. The reality of these people's careers is they need to publish high-impact papers. And so the problem is that when you focus on these kinds of critiques that are essentially, cherche le dollar, in the sort of muckraking style of, like, as if you were like Ida Tarbell from 1905, indicting the Rockefellers. That's the style of critique that our society likes to hear and wants to hear, and that people are sort of rewarded for that kind of critique because it's sort of the usual critique, and it's a considerably as either a sort of a deep critique of the motivations here or as an angle for fixing the systemic problems, it's considerably it's kind of a false affordance in a way, because you're like, oh, if I can only, end this corruption, our selfless scientists would be, out there doing selfless, safe science, right? And, when you say, okay, the problem is the metrics by which science is funded and judged, and by which scientists' careers advance, and also the fact that if this is a mockery in the U.S., it's a mockery squared in China. Every scientist knows what a Chinese paper mill is. Every scientist knows that basically, these incentives exist in China, and as a result, you get this like morass of low-quality papers. And to some extent, that same phenomenon affects American science as well. And that's a considerably less popularly accessible, sort of story than, did you ever see the movie Contagion with Jude Law? The Soderbergh film about a coronavirus epidemic? Contagion. And it's kind of an amazing little film in some ways, because it gets all the details wrong, even though it's about a bat coronavirus pandemic, directed by the great Steven Soderbergh. And it has Jude Law as like a rogue leftist journalist who's questioning the status quo, because at the time, this was made in like 2005 or something. At the time, questioning the authorities was felt to be a left-wing thing rather than a right-wing thing. Yeah. I know it sounds crazy, but believe me, I was there. I remember it. It's absolutely true. And so basically, Jude Law's critique of the virus and the vaccine is that it all can be cured by forsythia extract. Actually, you may have seen the yellow flowers in the spring and around DC. The irony of and of course the drug companies are profiting and blah blah blah. And at the end, he's actually arrested for selling fake coronavirus cures, and you feel you're on the side of the cops, right? And as the audience. And so the thing is that basically, it's interesting because he's following this sort of well-worn path of this is the kind of narrative that shocks and outrages people. Here are these people who are supposed to be curing us, but actually, killing us because they wanted to make a profit off of, et cetera, et cetera.
No, I don't accept that. I'm making more of a market critique that it's because of government monopoly funding in science that just mutates these things.
Yes. I mean, sure. But the thing is that, my point is not why you personally are making this critique. The point is why it's basically an attractor. It's an attractive critique because it is highly parsable. And I'm not even disagreeing with the critique.
Right.
Necessarily.
You're saying you need to look. You need to look even deeper. You
need to basically ask why. This is the sort of thing that prospers the best, rather than I would like to think, somewhat subtler critique that I just gave. And so you basically you're like, I hear this, and the subtler critique also strikes much harder at these institutions, because it says you must change your life. This way of doing business is what killed 10 million people, and look at this way of doing business. It's a mockery. It's a mockery, and basically the temple is full of money changers. But the thing is, when the form of the critique, and this is a very unusual critique, and it doesn't match any of the sort of patterns of like sort of formula stories that people are familiar with, and your story does. And so the thing is that as someone who's following, what is the narrative here, it's not so much that this makes your story wrong, it's that it makes it tempting, and you sort of have to basically pull away from following those temptations, because the only way you're going to prevail is by being right where they're wrong. You can't beat power when it's wrong, but you're also wrong. Like, you can't, like, the whole, and I see this attitude, this sort of I'm not accusing you of this attitude, but I see this attitude of kind of like, they're careless with the truth, so we can be careless with the truth, all over the place. And I'm like, motherfucker, whose boot is on whose neck, right? And like, yeah, they get to be careless with the truth. They get to just lie like motherfuckers, right? And the only weapon that you have is that you don't do that, and you actually really care about really being right.
So my running hypothesis and my critique of why these things are getting it wrong on so many levels is that they're operating on a paradigm that needs to have. So, like you look at Thomas Kuhn and the idea of, in order for a paradigm shift to happen, you have to have enough anomalies stack up so that it creates kind of a revolutionary, displacement of the past paradigm. And what I'm suggesting is, for so long, the public has had that low-resolution, cartoonish version of what I'm saying, which is, yeah, those pharmaceutical companies are just so, greedy and rich, and they're just getting us sick for no reason. It's like, well, that doesn't do anything. But if we actually understand the mechanism by which government monopoly of funding retards our ability to know how to shift to a new paradigm, that's where we need to start stacking up the anomalies for the public to see, look, this isn't working. I'll give you one more example for that.
But
yeah, go ahead.
Yes, you can give me the example, but I have a definitive.
Well, the other one is, it's been happening for a long time, which is something I've been investigating on the show. We had on this team they published a paper in Frontiers in Physiology, UC Davis professor Bruce Hammack and J. Bruce German, they're veterans in the field of looking at linoleic acid, which is this, is from vegetable oil consumption, right? So our government has been subsidizing and pushing vegetable oil consumption to the detriment of animal fat consumption for several decades now.
Right.
Ansel Keys
and it's turned all our guts into linoleum.
Right. And my point is just to say that, they published a paper just recently, we had them on the show to talk about it, where they're showing, folks who have severe cases of COVID who end up having ARDS, they have this high amount of leukotoxin, which is the direct mechanism which is creating this cytokine cascade. And leukotoxin is produced by the consumption of linoleic acid. That's where we get this high storage of leukotoxin, which turns into an acute respiratory stress.
Another fine example of this, is the funniest thing about COVID by far is the 6 foot thing, because, and this has been very well debunked by the most mainstream of mainstream media, which is the 6 foot thing comes from, and it turns out to go back to like weird 1930s science that was never like properly verified, that results from like a weird phobia of the Victorian idea of miasmas, and so it's a completely cultural phenomenon and in science, and basically this led to this belief that airborne stuff was rare and droplet stuff was common, which just defied common sense if you thought about it for about 3 seconds, and defied all of these like empirical things like the Diamond Princess, and where there was only airborne contact, and like this was just it was just a level of screw up that sort of got into every Taco Bell in the country, right? And people assumed that they had these like 6 foot bubbles of safety around them. And like, it was all just completely like, it was almost as bad as like shitty cloth masks, right? And I'm a big fan of real masks. I don't like bitch masks, or as I sometimes call them, right? But fucking bandana around your mouth is like. But in any case, yeah, this was a sort of this was this massive screw up, but. Just to pick a bone with your solution to this problem, Kuhn, of course, is like, anomalies stack up and to him, anomalies are a kind of fuel, that fuel the revolution. And Kuhn just assumes that the spark is somewhere and that besides the fuel, you also have the oxygen. And actually, you're in an environment with no oxygen and no spark. And so you can pile up all the fuel you want, and the public is not going to do shit.
Because you're saying there's no power that's interested in your approach, right? There's no power.
Yeah, there's no power, there's no institution, there's no force for a revolution of any kind. And so
But what if you have a car and it's a horse, there's a monopoly of transportation at the turn of the century, and they're saying no, you can't have anything but horse and buggy, and you're driving around the car to show the public, look, you can actually have a car. You don't have to live in the Department of Transportation's dystopia of horse and buggy. You see,
the variable here is your public is your oxygen and your spark, and instead, basically, what the public sees is they see, oh, here's a bunch of people who probably have some credentials and and went to school, and they have some long paper which I can't be bothered to read. And, they're cranks, and why should I read them, right? And so you basically can't, and then the next thing after that you have is you have people that are basically go to sort of a pro-crank, viewpoint, and they're like, oh, I'm just going to believe anything I see on the internet that I find convincing because I can make up my mind for myself. I'm a free human being. And, right, and then your idea of it's like, Antonio Regalado, a very well-known science reporter, said, very early in COVID about that, he's like, if this is proven to be a lab leak, it will be an earthquake that upsets science as we know it. That was much too optimistic. And, the reality is he's assuming the oxygen in the spark. He's basically like, oh, yeah, we're going to pipe, this fuel and the public will explode and you just pin us all to oak trees with their pitchforks or something. No, that's not going to happen. There's no mechanism for that to happen. There's no way that can happen. It's simply not possible. It's like a sort of dream of the 18th century that somehow, imposed itself on a very different century. You just don't have that energy. Moreover, even if you had that energy, it's by no means clear what the public would do. Right? Would they be like, oh, we got to think for ourselves and trust whatever we see on Alex Jones? No. Do you want that? Would that actually work? No. Okay. What's your, that's plan B. What's your plan C? Right? You're basically like, we have to, restore the free marketplace of ideas. Nothing is impeding the free marketplace of ideas. The free marketplace of ideas gives you shit with occasional nuggets of gold and which are almost impossible to distinguish from the shit.
Especially when you have Facebook deleting the Slovakian government's page about ivermectin. You know what I mean? That's their government page.
Facebook starts whacking, the powers that be realize that they, want to start whacking this competitor, which is actually a shitty competitor, but the guilty flee where no man pursueth, on the head with sticks. And, there are reasons for doing that. And maybe there are many things that they knock on the head with sticks that deserve to have to be knocked on the head with sticks. Right. And so, the principle that no one should be knocked on the head with a stick is an anarchist principle. It's not an American principle. I don't believe that principle. I believe that error has no rights whatsoever. But, if you knock something that isn't error on the head with a stick, boy, you really just stepped in it. And you've committed a very serious offense. And that's, clearly what's been going on here in more than one direction, but you're still basically postulating as the alternative to this thing. You still don't have really even have a dog in the fight, right? You brought no dog to the dog fight because you have no alternative for this way of doing things. Your only alternative is a sort of strange 18th century abstraction, which arguably never worked even in the 18th century, and we're definitely not in the 18th century. And so you're like, how to, does this violate, American values? Sure. Have American values been continually violated for quite some time? Sure. Did they ever work in the first place? Answer unclear, ask again later. The Thomas Jefferson had this line where he was like, I think this is the younger Thomas Jefferson before he'd tussled with Callender and his libels, and he's like, I would prefer a press with no government to a government with no press, right?
Mm-hmm.
And basically that's, I'm like, okay, TJ, you got it. This is what we have with a press with no government, right? And because you have no central force you have a press with no government, you have a university with no government, you have no force that can stand above these things, right? And if you're opposed to them in a serious and practical way, rather than in a sort of, I can get more YouTube views by complaining way, then you're like, okay, what force could I imagine that could be made to stand above these? What force could I imagine that could compete with these? And when your answer is basically the libertarian answer of no force, there will, it's almost a Marxist thing. You're like, well, what will happen to the state? You're like, well, the state will wither away. Well, Lenin actually concluded that the state would not wither away. So he really, he made Marx more effective there. And, but Lenin's state also did not wither away. And so when you have this kind of expectation that the anomalies will pile up and the revolution will happen and the regime will wither away and truth will prevail, it's basically, it's this... You don't see it as an attitude of despair, but I think it's very much an attitude of despair, because your attitude is essentially, I cannot imagine any way of this problem being systematically solved. And, and therefore I choose not to even imagine the question. And I'm like, no, I can imagine how I gave you a very specific plan earlier. Like, I can imagine how this would be systematically solved without basically taking all the virologists in the U.S. and packing them into buses and taking them down to a ravine and shooting them in the back of the head, which many Americans would rather do. No, that is not necessary. That is not like your only alternative to basically saying virologists must not be in charge of virology. Does Peter Daszak, deserve to go to jail? Yes, I believe that Peter Daszak deserves to go to jail. But, as Gandalf said to Frodo, many live who deserve death, and many die who deserve life. And it's like, is the most important thing the sort of emotional response of like, let's get the people who are, stealing, who caused people to die, or let's get this culprit or that culprit or the other culprit. I mean, if you could solve all of these problems while at the same time, these systemic problems, while at the same time making Daszak and Fauci billionaires, I would say just go for it. Mm-hmm. Right. And that's a very different perspective from the instinctive populist perspective.
But your proposed, your solution was based on a monarchist kind of.
Sure.
Shift,
I mean,
right?
you basically need now, you have two problems here. One is that basically virologists are insufficiently conscientious. Okay. That's true. And anything that basically turns that science back into an actual science, is probably going to lead to a restoration of standards across the board, including, there's something that cops tell you about not getting in trouble. It's a lecture they give to all teenagers, and it's basically like, don't do stupid things in stupid places with stupid people, right? And what you saw here was basically virology doing stupid things in stupid places with stupid people. And so, does there have to be a virology police at some level? Does there have to be? Yes, there does. And so there has to be basically a power which is separated from the power of virology as a whole. And that power, has to be an organization. And the normal way that organizations that actually get things done in the real world, whether they're, your local Taco Bell franchise or SpaceX or Intel is to put one person at the top. And yeah, that's basically like all functional organizations are monarchies. And so when I'm saying you need a functional organization here, to say you need a monarchy here is, they're synonyms. So that's essentially
and what's the difference between that and kind of what I'm suggesting is to privatize science?
Well, when you privatize science, you see that, there's a number of problems. First of all, it doesn't solve the problem of, who controls what experiment you can do at all, which actually seems to be a problem. There needs to be, so, when your science is privatized, first of all, you have that problem. Secondly, you have an enormous public good problem, because when you privatize anything that is a business whose returns, if science really should exist, science is one of two things. It's either astronomy, it's basically a hobby carried out for fun. I guess astronomy includes like asteroid defense, but other than that, who cares? You can't really say it affects like Ohio, or the second reason is you're basically doing it for the public good. And the idea of this is done for the public good with as privatized in the sense of that, in the sort of capitalist sense, there's just simply, there's simply no return on the investment. It doesn't work as a business. Now, you can interpret that in a slightly different sense, which is closer to what I mean. You can basically say, let's go back to the way science was funded before World War II. So if you go back to the way science was funded before World War II, you have simply the absence of state funding means that you have many, all of this is basically philanthropic at one level or another, unless it's basically you're supported because you teach at a university. But the variety of philanthropic support was much, much greater. And it's that variety which is essentially essential. Now, my sort of plan is similar to yours, except that my plan is basically funding neutral. And so you're saying, okay, we're going to create that variety simply by, rather than having even just a bunch of rich people have to step up and fund science, the Epsteins of the world. You're essentially proposing the Epstein model, which is not a bad model, even though Epstein was bad. It's
how about Westinghouse or something?
Yeah, Westinghouse or something. There you go, right? But even Westinghouse is a businessman. Right. and Einstein was not a businessman. I'm talking more like Solvay, right? So, who Ernst Solvay, the financier who organized the famous Solvay conference on physics. So, you have some of that, but the thing is that, the real difference between my proposal and your proposal is that your proposal to just kill all this funding makes a bunch of enemies, and my proposal doesn't make any enemies at all. It just requires basically more, it's not, and so when you basically have a restructuring plan and you actually want to win over your enemies while reforming them, if you're not essentially fighting against them, then you're basically better advised to preserve their funding streams rather than cutting them and making enemies of them. And actually, if you can offer them a deal like this deal, which is actually much better than the deal they have at present, while sort of cutting the strings of power, you have kind of a win-win situation. There's a lot of this doesn't apply only to science. There's a lot of government beneficiaries out there. And when those government beneficiaries are basically a source of power for the government because their benefits are conditional. As you know, for example, the Supreme Court has ruled that Social Security benefits are not a right? So you don't actually own that, stream of funding. Well, because you don't actually own that stream of funding, you can be jacked around through it. You can basically have the government say, well, if you vote for, the Democrat, we're going to give you more money next year, which is a pretty, I think most theories of Republican governance would look askance on that way of running the show. I don't think John Stuart Mill would really approve of that form of governance, but be that as it may, if that's what you're up against, what you want to do is either you can try to outbid them and use that power yourself, or you can try to neutralize the power in a way that the beneficiaries would approve of. And if you say to Social Security, recipients, well, first you had this umbilical from the government. What we're going to do is basically value that umbilical. We're just going to print you all the fucking money. We're going to take that, securitize it, turn it into a bond, sell the bond, do the equivalent of that. We're all in funny money world here anyway. Yeah, we have to get out of that, but that's quite a different question. So we're just going to print you this massive, we're going to show up at your door with like a suitcase full of Benjamins. Just lay them out. We're going to do a selfie with you in this huge pile of money. The government is not going to have any obligations to you at all in the future. This is your money to spend as you wish. Blow it all at a casino and then starve. But we're not connected to you anymore. And because we're not connected to you anymore, we don't have political power over you, and you're basically no longer a member of the free shit army.
So your idea is kind of like a transitionary stage to what I'm trying to do. You're trying to actually figure out I'm trying to transition like the Soviet Union going into handing it off to oligarchs.
How do you use absolute power to transition, to a healthy state in a healthy way, right? And so, the thing is, when you're looking at this question of how do you use absolute power to get this done, by definition, if you have absolute power, these people aren't your enemies. They all belong to you. Right. And so your job is to basically heal and reform them, and maybe get the people who shouldn't be virologists into something more, like crocodile farming or something, but even then, you're like, if Peter Daszak, maybe he could be a zookeeper. I don't know. That's where he came from. Like you have to, so you have to essentially say, when you're basically looking at a transition plan, which, is essentially in practice ruthless for a bunch of people. For example, leaving them unemployed, leaving them, that is more of a sort of post-Soviet dysfunction kind of thing. If you're just sort of thinking abstractly and you're like kind of wishing it would get to some state or other, you're thinking in a much less productive way than if you think about actual transition procedures. Make sense?
Yeah. So this is something that is not just an intellectual exercise for you, but you really think it's something that could be a form of.
Well, we're all performing intellectual exercises here. I mean,
Right.
the thing is that what I would say is that my intellectual exercise routine is just frankly more rigorous than other people's. And
Right.
like you're lifting Nerf weights, I'll lift real weights. You come lift real weights with me. Anyone can do it.
Right.
And clearly, if you're thinking about this in any other sense, why are you thinking about it? Like, why, just if you accept the status quo and you see no particular
Right. Yeah,
reasonable,
obviously,
practical way to transition to another status quo, just go out and grill, man. Like there's states you could be grilling right now.
The point I'm trying to make is like, I don't see how, and I haven't seen the fullness of your argument, but I don't see how that practically, the proposal of moving to a monarchy would fly in any time soon in America, given, like you said,
well,
the culture.
First of all, it has flown in America within the lives of those now living, because as you may know, Franklin Delano Roosevelt was effectively a monarchy. And one thing I like to do is read the last 10 paragraphs of his first inaugural address, which is basically, when I replace the names of American institutions with those of German institutions, everyone assumes it's a Hitler speech, and especially if you do it with the cadence of Hitler, right? And but if you go and read that address, you'll be, yes, FDR's Washington is a monarchical Washington. This is completely accepted by all Americans and revered by all Americans. So is Lincoln's Washington. So is Washington's Washington. And so, it's actually, you sort of confuse, first of all, because you're attached to these ceremonies of the American system and its historic rituals, it's very easy to overlook the fact that those historic rituals have very little to do with what is practiced in Washington today. They have very little to do with the reality of government. What we have today is basically an oligarchy, which is the decayed remnant of FDR's monarchy. And so, once you basically, if you're still thinking within the dream, yes, it seems completely improbable that this very real thing, which is actually the normal system of government across history and the normal system by which everything that works even now, here, and today happens, it's very easy to think of that as sort of, bizarre, and these kind of fantastic pink unicorns that we grow up reading about in the news every day is completely real. And yet, what I'm getting at in a way is that you're absolutely right. To experience any kind of regime change, you need a sort of an almost religious kind of reversal in the psychology of the citizens. And, that was true in the Soviet Union as well. When you looked at Soviet citizens in the 1980s, when you looked at Soviet dissidents in the 1980s, no one predicted, imagined, hoped for the fall of the Soviet Union. They were all trying to fix it. But reality, they were all, and in America, the same. They were all like trying to converge the two systems, right? And reality disagreed with all these people. Reality had a different vote. Reality said, no, actually, this is the only way that this will get fixed. And so when your rhetoric is sort of unavoidably, if the fatal flaw of the American left is that its rhetoric evolves to favor whatever is powerful and keeps the powerful in power. The fatal flaw of the American right is that because, and this is a right that sort of emerges from nothing after World War II. It's not even really a continuation of the old right in any substantial sense. And this right is not an elitist right. It's very much a populist right. And the failure of the populist right is that basically its ideas evolve toward what is most popular. And and basically it gets in the habit of telling people what they want to hear. And what they want to hear, and at its best, as we discussed with, as I said, I took the horse paste. I took ivermectin, right? I'm still basically agnostic on the actual benefits of ivermectin. But the thing is, the story of, basically people are denied this cheap drug because it's on patent is like something you might read in the Anderson Valley Advertiser from 1975. It's like a classic trope of like 70s and 80s. It's Silkwood, basically. It's this classic trope of 70s and 80s Hollywood. And so, despite the fact, that, this specific story, as we discussed, is not at all utterly devoid of foundation, either as regards the drugs or as the problem with, problems of approving, off-patent medication, but it's also the story that the crowd will lap up easily because of its connection to these tropes that they've all seen in movies made by Hollywood back when Hollywood was trying to convince you the corporations were evil and bad, right? And so,
any new FDR type president need to use those kind of stories to get the crowd on his side?
I think that history rhymes, but it doesn't repeat. And I think that the level of, perhaps you're not wrong, but perhaps you are wrong. That would be a very 20th century way of sort of creating popular energy and populist energy. And the danger or the difficulty of that is that you're fighting the last war in a sense. You're fighting because you're sort of, when you use the mindset of democracy against oligarchy, everything in oligarchy is organized to fight democracy. Everything is organized to basically blunt the peasants' the peasants with pitchforks, keep them out of D.C., keep them from storming the Capitol. It's like, just like, it's this, when you're part of America's governing class, like the fear of those who rule over you, which is a fear as concrete as any like medieval noble had of a peasant uprising, is very, very clear and concrete. And so when your approach toward defeating these people is that of a peasant uprising, you're basically marching straight into the teeth of their fortifications. And when you look at the strength available for this attack, what you see is that popular energy and has decreased in every generation of the 20th century. It's impossible, for example, to imagine, even if they had hadn't been demographically swamped, it's impossible to imagine something like the Prop 13 tax revolt, or the election of Reagan as governor when he delivered his real firebrand speeches back in the 60s. It's just impossible to imagine that level of energy today. And if you look at the level of energy that people put into politics before the war, it's just unimaginable. And so you're essentially saying, here we have this apathetic mob, that has charged this fortress 17 times before and came up with nothing every time. We need to rile them up. We need to, and because we're honest dissidents, we need to rile them up by finding the intersection of what is a true story and what is a story that basically gets people riled up. And, and gets them riled up in a certain way, because it gets them riled up in a sense that you're offering them power. You're saying to the people, look, your power is needed to correct these virologists, to dominate them, to rule over them. They haven't been governed well. You need to rule the virologists. And so you need to basically, through electing your politicians who will take control of the government, because how else does democracy work? You will need to take power over them. And then you elect your politicians and you find they have no power over the government, or you even fail to elect anyone and you grow totally, you develop what psychologists call learned helplessness. Like the Tea Party. Remember the Tea Party? Perfect example of this. Like, how many Tea Parties have there been since like 1950? Like a zillion, right? And they all die the same way. So it's a completely failed kind of strategy for revolt. And the reason that it fails is that you're basically attacking this fortress from the front. And instead, if as a citizen you were willing to say, which you're not, which most Republicans are very far from, you're accurately observing this, is there's a very long distance that needs to be traveled, where you basically, instead of saying by electing a leader, you're saying, in general, Republicans, because they actually believe in democracy, think of the politicians they elect as their agents. This is the famous, if you know it, the famous debate of letter of Burke to the Bristol electors. He's like, you elected me, but you elected me to govern, not to be your agent, right? And so if you think of basically, I elected Trump to do the things that I want to do, or that, we in the American parlance should do. I want a border wall. I elected Trump to build the border wall. You're not really delegating any power to Trump, because you're not saying to Trump, I will follow you. You're saying, I will follow you as long as you do what I want. And that's a very weak delegation of power. That leaves Trump with very little power. You're not saying the man who can fix this country is Trump. Whatever Trump wants to do is probably best. If he wants to build a border wall and a canal full of alligators, that's what America needs. If he wants to build a big, beautiful bridge so that everyone, from Honduras can get here on a people mover, that's what America needs. That's what whatever makes America great is what Trump wants. And that's not the way people ever thought about Trump, for kind of obvious reasons. And it's not who Trump was. It's not who he could be. And that basically meant that the amount of power that you're delegating to Trump is very, very weak, because you're not actually giving him power. You're basically using him as an extra, as a vehicle of power. And whereas, of course, the people who elected FDR, totally blindsided America with this plan, right? He ran on a plan of like conservative, low budget, he ran on a traditional Democratic platform, and then he governed like an extreme Republican. And to the point where that became known as the Democratic way to govern. And because of course the Democrats were the traditional party of small government and, et cetera, right? And so, you don't have to be quite as dishonest as FDR was. I don't think it would work to be as dishonest as FDR was about this. But you basically, to get an American monarchy, all you need is a president. You wouldn't be like, oh, I'm going to be, it wouldn't be like a ceremonial monarchy. You wouldn't be like, oh, we're going to elect Alex Jones and he'll declare himself Alexander the First or Alexander the Great, or, and then the Jones family will be our monarchs from now on. Monarchy is just literally a word that means the unilateral governance of one person. And so, what you would say is not, we're going to elect the Stuart dynasty or whatever, but we're going to elect someone who's going to run the government. And the position of this person will be that he is a constitutional president. In the Constitution, it says that the president is the chief of the executive branch. He will behave as the chief of the executive branch. In the Constitution, it does not specify the precedence of the legislative and the judicial branch. The president will be happy to listen to the advice of these co-equal branches, but will otherwise act unilaterally. And, basically you're saying, yeah, okay, you're electing a new FDR, maybe a little beyond FDR, because a little beyond FDR is frankly what you need. And if you don't want that, you want what we have now. And the definition, that is as some a long ago conservative said, that is a choice, not an echo. And that if you're, then from that perspective, you can say, okay, if you do this, what does this American Caesar do about science? Right? And what are the lessons of COVID in specific for what this American Caesar would do about science? Assuming that he can do anything about science because he's the president, and basically we've just taken him and made him the president, the unlimited president of a government that was already unlimited. So it would be great to get back to limited government, but we're nowhere near that where we are right now. And so, the question of how you do this is essentially, this is a solution straight out of American history.
But how does this conservative FDR times 10 deal with a Pentagon that's implementing critical theory as a policy?
Well,
and CIA and all this stuff?
Yeah. Okay. Excellent question. Okay. What do we have a Pentagon for? Literally, okay, I'm the president. I'm the chief of the executive branch. I'm the commander in chief of the armed forces. The purpose of the armed forces is to defend America. Okay. The current purpose of today's armed forces is to rule the world in some weird way. Okay, so the difference between the Pentagon we have and the Pentagon we need is you don't get there from here. You basically say, okay, we're going to take this whole system. We're going to send it home by default. We're going to identify the parts of it that we actually do need at the moment. We're going to conserve those parts. And those parts are going to prosper and be rebuilt into whatever America's military needs to be. But what America's a country, it needs a military. Clearly, the Canadians could stab us in the back. The Mexicans could come across the border. The Japanese could set out on their little fishing boats. There are threats to our security. The Basques, very violent people right there across the Atlantic, right? So, are there threats to American security? Yes, there are. Does it justify the existence of this organization? No, it doesn't. And so you're basically like, yeah, okay, what do you do with the Pentagon? You retire it. You accelerate everybody's pension vesting. You're like, okay, unless you're part of, the remaining forces, probably mostly, the special forces, the Coast Guard,
but what if they don't want to retire is what I'm saying. Like, how does that,
what if they don't want to retire? You're the president. They're in the executive branch. You retire them.
Even when Trump was suggesting that he didn't like the outcome, the Pentagon, the Joint Chiefs came out and said, no, he's going home. Bye-bye. You know what I mean? They let him know that, you don't get to talk about
that
this.
was a little, too late. The idea that all of these institutions are just ideas. They're just ideas that people have of things that exist. Of course, being a lame duck president is exactly the worst time to actually use your power. The best time is as soon as you get it. And so essentially, once you elect this constitutional president, yeah, why would you wait around? Like, I mean, forget the Pentagon. Really, I'm biased because I grew up in the State Department, but the heart of it is really state. And yeah, it just ceases to exist. It's like, how do you deal with the Stasi after you're elected the president of East Germany? I'm like, what Stasi? I'm like, tomorrow, everybody who's in the building goes home. The building's doors are padlocked. Your salary will continue to be direct deposited until we figure out how this is restructured. Play some board games with your kids.
So you're going to keep you're keeping the virologists on longer than the State Department.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, I think the virologists are much more useful than the State. I think they're much more reformable than the State Department. I think they're 1,000,000 times more reformable than the State Department.
Because they actually
and the State Department is full of wonderful people. All these people should be writing their goddamn novels, and instead they're writing fucking cables. Like, you know how many good novels would come out of the shutdown of the State Department? Like, I mean, it's unbelievable. And so essentially you're like, you can't do any of this stuff halfway or 1/10 of the way or 1,000th of the way or any of it. You basically have to be elected to launch a transition, and that transition has to happen. And there's no, like, you're not like, one of my concerns with kind of the next time, a serious effort is made to disrupt the deep state is that Trump did such a bad job of it. He didn't get the right people. He didn't even fill half of his appointments. He didn't get Trump supporters or people who like actually believed in, his ideas, which were really no more than common sense, were a tiny fraction of these people. And I worry that, the next time they're like, okay, well, let's do this right, it'll be like, yeah, we'll put capable, Trump supporters in all 4,000 political appointee jobs. And they'll be absolutely useless because they won't have any authority over the system. The reality is that if you talk to anyone in Washington who actually does stuff in Washington, and you're like, they call it the executive branch, but it's actually the legislative branch, they'll nod at you because, of course, it's obvious that the executive branch is the legislative branch, and the authority of the president over it is symbolic and, frankly, kind of Queen Elizabeth-like. Mm-hmm. And so if you're going to change that, the case that you're making, you always need a case for legitimacy. The case that you're making is that basically the Congress, through micromanaging funding and personnel and all of these other things, has basically captured this branch and abused the Constitution to turn the executive branch into a legislative branch. And in doing that, it's essentially disempowered the American voter because, due to Congress's like incumbency and seniority bullshit, the only meaningful election that people vote in is the presidency. And so you're essentially saying, hey, here's how your oligarchy works. You basically disabled democracy by cutting this wire and that wire and the other wire. So, we don't think democracy works, but, we do think this country needs a government, so we're going to elect a president who's actually a president, and he's going to clean up all this shit. And everything that this system is, does Washington have a lot of jobs that need to actually be done? Yes, it does. Do they need to be done by the same people in the same offices? Probably not. Are you going to, there's this mistake that's always made by people who are like, oh, if I get in charge of pulling the wires, I'm going to be able to pull the wires to make this machine do what I want it to do. So an example is this guy, Dominic Cummings, who was the mastermind behind Brexit. And then he was Boris Johnson's chief advisor. I don't know Dominic Cummings. I probably know some people who know him. But he was all like, let's very smart guy, very inspired by the startup world, which is the capable world of our day. And his idea is like, oh, I'm going to get into Whitehall and run the UK government like a startup. And it was just completely impossible. It's not anything like that. You can't pull the wires in those directions, in those ways. And if Dominic Cummings had ever actually worked in a startup, he would know that. And, but there's no repairing these bureaucracies. So absolutely, when you say, I don't like the way this thing works, I don't like the way the science bureaucracy has funded virology. Yeah, the science bureaucracy needs to stop existing. Not as human beings, but as an institution. Virology as an institution needs to stop existing, but virology as a science is actually good. And so, how do you sort of perform that act of enormous demolition? And then, the question is, how do you get the public support for an act of that kind of act of prodigious, demolition? And, the way I would answer that question is that I think the way you get that support is by motivating them in a 21st century way and not a 20th century way. If you're motivating them in the 20th century way, you're motivating a bunch of angry peasants with pitchforks. You're calling on people are being killed, by evil scientists for money. You're basically calling on all of these kinds of demotic tropes to make the people out there stop feeling apathetic and feel powerful.
You're summoning the gods of the crowd, right?
You're summoning the gods of the crowd. And the 21st century way, and the gods of the crowd always has gods. There's always a crowd. The crowd always matters. But the thinking of the crowd has changed. And today, what we have is not, the crowd of 100 years ago was a profoundly sincere and energetic and angry and violent crowd. The crowd of today is profoundly frivolous, profoundly ironic, and profoundly nonviolent. And so, and it's really in specific, the level of mass capacity for irony that exists in the American population today has probably never been exceeded in human history, right? Irony is everywhere. It used to be this pastime reserved for the rich. It was sort of, the caviar of wit. Today, it's in every fucking, commercial, and every 13-year-old knows how to be ironic. That's kind of a strength in a way, because, if you play to that strength, it's basically that our irony and even that frivolity, that strength is a strength that can actually detach itself and cast things away very easily. And so, the conservative assumption is that everyone went to school, they did the Pledge of Allegiance. They're very attached, to this thing. They have these strong political sentiments, because they're Americans and they do the Norman Rockwell thing and all of that. And, I think they're just frivolous, bored pseudo-aristocrats who, even if they don't have any money, have the morals of aristocrats. And you have to basically stimulate them in a way that essentially, when the next regime change happens, it will be ironic. It will be kind of a joke. It will be nonviolent, and it will be just yeah, fuck it. And, the spirit of, yeah, fuck it, this whole thing is trash, and let's throw it in the trash, and let's try something that's just fucking crazy, is actually a... And I'm not saying, no, can this happen tomorrow? No, it can't. But it's a way, even Trumpism had a sincerity to it, but it had a lot of irony to it. I think, Trump is much, even Reagan was pretty funny sometimes, and Trump is much more ironic as a communicator than Reagan. And so, when you look at, for example, the God Emperor Trump memes, it has exactly this spirit where, if only Trump was someone who would have made a good God Emperor, that would be a slightly different story. But when, people are yeah, fuck it, let's just have Trump for God Emperor, they behave in a way that is really, yes, it is antithetical to the glorious American tradition or whatever, but it's very consistent with today's American reality. Make sense?
Yeah. So, but is it possible to find someone, like you said, Trump can't measure up to the brand that would be necessary to make it work?
Is it possible to find someone who's capable of the job? I mean, you need
to do American Idol scouting.
Yeah,
tour,
but it's like saying who should be the CEO of Apple. Well, if Tim Cook dies, who's competent to be the CEO of Apple? Well, in Silicon Valley, you can probably throw a stone and find 5 or 6 or 50 people who are competent to run Apple. And
it's actually, you were talking about irony, though. It's actually, we're in a stage where that would probably be where you would find your next political leaders to literally do an American Idol.
Basically, I love the idea of electing Elon Musk. He's not technically eligible because he's an African, but that's even just, I mean, that's how alpha is that to elect someone who's not eligible? What, are they going to lock the door when he comes to walk in the White House? I mean, and it's just it's a power play, right? And the contrast here, it's like, I think that for me, on a really large historical scale, the most important question is, are we living in the late Roman Republic or the late Roman Empire? And hopefully we're living in the late Roman Republic. But there's also a lot of imperial decline signs around, but there were a lot of those in the late Roman Republic anyway. And one of the things they noticed, and maybe we should wrap up around here. One of the things they noticed in the late Roman Republic is that the Roman Republic had a way of doing things, had a way of getting stuff done that involved basically sort of delegating work to senators, and and there was a lot of litigation, and it just didn't work very well. And one problem that the Roman world had around that time is that it was the Mediterranean was infested with pirates, and there was another way of doing things in Rome at that time, and it was the army way. And the army way is most typically associated with Caesar, who would build a bridge across the Rhine in 3 days, and just perform these incredible feats of organization and management, and and just prevail over much larger forces seemingly effortlessly. This wasn't Caesar. This was one of his rivals, Pompey, who was not as good a politician, but I had some capacity as a general. And somehow the Roman Senate, after dealing with this pirate problem, which was sort of like the drug gang problem in Mexico, these people are all embedded. There have been multiple generations of pirates that are all embedded in the local political structure, et cetera, et cetera. They're like, okay, we're going to solve this problem, and we're going to delegate this one guy, Pompey, and we're going to basically make him the CEO of the Mediterranean, and he can do whatever he wants, however he wants, as long as he does it on the sea. And Pompey, in 3 months, without any computers, any IT, any networking, any firearms, anything like that, clears the whole Mediterranean of pirates in 3 months. And people are like, holy shit. And, there's a parallel for that in the modern world, which is that when some people from Silicon Valley came and made this website work for Obama, and you might remember that, where they're just like, God damn, these people can't even build a goddamn website, right? And we who know how to do things, and of course all the people who worked on this were libs to the core, right? But we who know how to do things can do them not just twice as efficiently, but 10, 100, 1,000 times as efficiently as it's done here. And so, to think of, actually the way I always imagined, a certain kind of regime change would be, it was a different guy who's ineligible, and probably wouldn't really work out. I imagined Gordon Ramsay. So you elect Gordon Ramsay as president, and then he goes into the State Department's fridge and starts pulling out these moldy heads of cabbage. He's like, and these terrorists, why are you funding these guys, right? And I see you're giving money to the Mali Liberation Revolution Front. Are people going to eat this?
And that would be fun.
And just sort of administering this dose. What Ramsay does at his best in these shows, in these Kitchen Nightmares shows, I guess is the series I'm talking about, is he just administers this brutal dose of reality to this little cluster of groupthink that has grown up around just severely bad practices, right? And that reality is just and then you you
can imagine him yelling at them as they botch the Syria thing, guys.
Yeah. You said Assad must go. Why did you say Assad must go? You put this in the food. It's in the food.
Go back. Do it again. Go back.
Right. And so, and that's really to me, that, and not the Princess Di, is essentially the soul of what I mean by monarchism. It's essentially the power of it's sort of the only way to sweep these things clean with a clean broom. And in most cases, the only way to sweep them out is just to blow them up. Usually Gordon can fix the restaurant, but in this case, basically sometimes Gordon concludes that this restaurant should not exist. It doesn't mean the people need to stop existing. It doesn't mean, it just means that this is not working for anyone. And the thing is, when you go to those people in the Pentagon and the army, and here's the thing about regime change, is that preference falsification is a real thing. And 3 weeks after you dissolved the Stasi in East Germany, I'm sure everyone who was a Stasi officer was like, yeah, that was completely fucked up. I'm glad it's over. Right? Everybody in these organizations hates their jobs. Right? And so you're basically telling them, except for a few fanatics, even the few fanatics are fanatics because they're kind of addicted to power. And in a world where their fanaticism does not bring them any power, if they were those kind of people, they wouldn't be fanatics. They'd be dissidents like us, right? And so but so many people are like, yeah, this is just fucked, but this is how the world works. So if you're basically like, okay, we're going to unfuck it by retiring you. Your job no longer exists. You got your retirement benefits in a lump sum. Buy an RV, drive around the country, just like, we'll find you something to do, but like, just you need to chill out for a while, and like, just we need to reflect on how over this thing is, right? And that's a very different, that's a very different kind of revolution from this kind of high energy leftist peasants with pitchforks in the street kind of revolution. It's, and that's the only thing that I can sort of see.
You're trying to be realistic. Like, good natured.
Yeah, it's cozy. It's a cozy revolution. They called in Czechoslovakia, the Velvet Revolution. Right. And so, and the thing is that, that is so different from the spirit of the American revolutionary LARPer, it's just, it's night and day. And so the thing is, educating people to think in this way is, I think, the most, that's why am I on your show today, David? But one last question, maybe?
Yeah. I want to wrap it up. We've had a lot of great time here, and I want to wrap it up here. But I do want to ask before we go, since you've been talking about these institutions failing and how we need something totally new to shake things up at a foundational level to get competence back, I want to get into the topic just briefly here about, the UFOs, okay? I have to.
Yeah.
All right. So I'm going to interview Lou Elizondo, the guy who's the whistleblower who came out in 2017. He was running ATIP, the program that was tasked with investigating these phenomenon. So that report's coming out this month. Here we are in the month of June. What's your take on this? What were your questions that you would have if there was a great leader like Elon Musk running the show?
My take is that I'm very skeptical. I've always been a skeptic, so I'm a skeptic of both UFOs and UFO skeptics. I think that Elon Musk, posted the graph of camera fidelity, UFO picture fidelity, the main thing that a scientist has to do, or someone who wants to think scientifically, is avoid fooling themselves. When I look at the camera evidence that we have is not super duper impressive, and it's a lot easier to believe in sensor bugs than it is to believe in extraterrestrial visitors. The eyewitness evidence, I would say, is somewhat more impressive. I think that certainly the proper thing to do is to sort of get rid of these strange World War II habits and open up this evidence. The Drive had a theory that it's a combination of Russian and Chinese drones trying to spoof our electronic warfare systems. Seems a little advanced for the Russians and Chinese, but you never know. I'm relatively agnostic on these things. I don't, at the same time, the assumption that just because the Pentagon worked on this, it must be done competently, is, I think, a relic of maybe 1940s thinking. I think that it's very easy to imagine a lot of very incompetent, screwed up shops at the Pentagon. I'm very curious I would press Elizondo relatively hard about, his connections to Harry Reid and Bigelow, and, whether this is really this is easily something that the Pentagon would just sort of do randomly with a bunch of shit tier farts just to get Congress off its back. It's like, sure, we'll spend, $23 million on men staring at goats or whatever. And so, it's relatively easy for me to see. I don't know that Elizondo's sort of pretensions that he's just an ordinary guy keeping America safe, who got into this stuff because he saw that, the evidence is real and America needs to, be kept safe. I wouldn't sort of take that as automatic because of his rank and his position. I would be like, yeah, maybe this is just some weirdo who works at the Pentagon. And, knowing the competence of the Pentagon and how well they've done. And so that's sort of or, let's not, okay, let's not go there. The idea that the Pentagon would do something stupid and incompetent, even in the direction of like being pro-UFO, is not at all surprising to me. So I would basically push on the shakier sides of that story. I would go, before I interviewed Elizondo, I would go watch those Mick West videos and decide what you think of Mick West, who I have some respect for. Essentially, it's a hard evidentiary problem, and it should be given the respect it deserves. Clearly, all this evidence should be made public. I have real doubts in explaining how these experienced Navy aviators could be seeing with their own eyes things that don't actually exist. But humans are a very fallible species. Their computers and sensors are also extremely fallible. So maybe, the eyes and the sensors both failed that day. Maybe is it impossible that extraterrestrial life is visiting our planet? Of course it's not impossible. So that would be basically my relatively reserved take there. What I try not to do is basically take a polarized dispute like this and basically instinctively choose a side based on sort of cultural polarizations. I'm also pretty agnostic, for example, about, say, the Kennedy assassination. I just don't see, it's very hard to disentangle. There's a lot of potential theories. Some of them are more plausible than others. LBJ has these thug friends or whatever, but I just think we'll never really know. And it certainly looks to me like the bullet came from in front. I don't have, part of being very, very committed to the truth is being very, very committed to agnosticism in a situation where you really can't make up your mind. The COVID lab leak, to me, is not one of those situations. But I think it's a null hypothesis for me. Show me the goose that the bat bit, But yeah, that's how I feel about UFOs. I hope you find that.
Well, very cool. So you would, if they are from another planet, you would want them to subscribe to your Substack, would you not?
I would absolutely want them to subscribe to my Substack, which is graymirror.substack.com. Thank you so much for our talk today. I'm looking forward to my new flood of alien subscriptions. Have a great one, David.